Are you the last American vagabond?
Well, I mean, the name, I'll probably just say no. I think there's plenty more, especially, hopefully, because of what we do. There's plenty more people out there that embody what I think that represents, and when I first started that, it was, wasn't even really like this defined, like metaphor in my mind. It just kind of jumped into my mind. I was always a big traveler, and I know vagabond in the sense of just kind of like, travel being the focus, not the destination, not the derogatory way that word can be used, and it felt like something that mattered to me, like that we're because at the time we're traveling a lot, and we were in the RV traveling across the US at that time, and I'd already traveled overseas, and it just kind of like, we're carrying on something like the old kind of like the, and the direction always lied, what's the phrase from, and the road always led west, kind of like that mindset. And so ultimately it developed into something, where simply put, as looking back at it, I've come to see it as sort of like the never-ending pursuit of truth, and so I don't think I'm the only one. Clearly, I think tons of us exist, but even more so, even just through the Last American Vagabond perspective, I think that because of that, many, many people have now sort of embodied the idea of what that means, never just settling with what somebody told you last, but always seeking more information and always looking for more to develop your understanding. And I think that's powerful, and I think we share that.
I would add that the word vagabond in your instance could be replaced with vanguard.
Sorry, I like that. Thank you. I appreciate that. And, and I think we all are, I think right now the independent media sphere that we both share is, it's an interesting battlefield right now, and it is this constant ebb and flow. And I think right now, more than we've ever seen, and I think the entire existence of this field, we're winning. You know what I mean? Like, and it doesn't feel that way, because I think the more we change, the more that these things, despite the propaganda, despite the censorship, despite the every other way that we go, one step forward, two steps back in this field, we're still breaking through. Think about how powerful that is, And so it's like, they're going to make your life really uncomfortable because that's not what the power structure wants, but we're getting through, that's powerful, man. And so I see it the same way. We're on the front lines of whatever this is right now.
Yeah. I like to play around with metaphors like battle of ideas and the trenches, information war, that kind of stuff. But do you think we really are in an information war?
Absolutely, 100%. Like, to the truest extent, extent of that phrase. Like, but in a lot of other ways too. But just the basic understanding of that. Like, we're at a war over what information, over information, over what it means, over how to interpret it. Over what sources are supposed to be, it's like every single element of it, down to just the core of just like what the meaning of words are, like this is a long-term manipulation. And so, yeah, 100%, we're in an ongoing information war, a narrative war, but, there's all sorts of other ways to get into that, just like kind of like I went into, but even deeper, where it comes into like, the definition side of it, or like the technocratic sort of social engineering, even to the level of like brainwashing, like we're in some, or even crazier, like neuroscience, it's like we're getting to some really crazy stuff. But yes, 100%, we're in the midst of this, and where it goes is hard to see, but clearly it seems like a lot is on the line. And I think we all sense that.
Would you go back, Ryan, to 2019, knowing what you know now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to say, because, right, I get the point of the question is, it's like, is ignorance bliss, right? And even though we clearly were not just blinded to everything, it's like, for a lot of people, I would say, I think probably we share the idea that we were not blinded by, like, more so the first ones to be like, yeah, that seems like there's something wrong, even before we knew, like there's clearly something that was off about that. But to the average person, it's a hard question. Like, is it better to be in a position where you don't know how bad things are, and maybe you're happier for it? Or is it better to understand how dark it is, maybe be able to change it, maybe not, but then exist within that unsettling reality? That's a hard question. It's a philosophical question. For me, I think it's obviously my choice is the latter. I mean, that's who I am as a person. I would always rather understand and suffer for it than live in ignorance and bliss because of ignorance. I just think that's obvious, because I think my core driving point is that I seek to change things for the better. And if you're stuck in ignorance, then that's just simply not possible, So I would definitely stick with where we are now, because I still feel very motivated that we're watching things shift for the better, or at least that we have an opportunity to see that happen if we stay with what we're doing.
I like what you're saying, because it indicates that you're not blackpilled.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. That's an interesting thing to bring up, because prior to the election of, the last election process, it was a really weird kind of just to quickly sum it up, we had been going on for a long time, and I point back to people like James Corbett, who I see as kind of a foundational element, if not one of the foundational elements in this field.
The OG.
Idea of, yeah, really, seriously. And even people today that reference him and don't ever have him on for interviews, it's just this weird kind of like he's not supposed to be acknowledged for obvious reasons. But, the idea that he had for a long time been like, vote nobody, 2016, whatever, And I always resonated with me. And obviously, if you understand it, which we should, if you're going to criticize anything, he's not saying, I don't care. That's the whole point of the black pill label is that, he's saying that this is a way, like, if you look into his argument, that this is, like I would argue, the system's broken. You're not actually participating. You're giving a false binary. You're, any different number of ways you could break it down. Even if you think your vote translates, the 1,000 ways that's manipulated, stolen, altered, lied about, And so our argument was always been, well, let's just protest, not ignore it, but obviously, on a side note, one of the choices that's supposed to be on your ballot every time is abstention, like legal, recognized, tallied abstentions. That's part of the process that they just ignore. And there's a reason for that, because they want you to think not choosing is being not part of it. The point, though, is that we've always been saying that, going and usually relegated to the corner, like children, these conspiracy theories, they don't know, And then weirdly, we've been doing this for a long time, James, even further. We get before this last selection process and we do it again. Vote nobody, 2025, and weird the response we got, like wild from large people that came around this weird movement, which has been there for a long time, and calling it, black pilled and it's a purity test. And to your point, it's like, well, hold on, we're very clearly invested in this and we have solutions that we discuss. And it's like, so the weird thing is those same people later were like, well, they're both bad options. And so I'm just going to pick Trump. That's black pilled. You're giving up by going, well, that's all we have, to a small degree. And then there's much more deeper versions of that. But it shows us that there's clearly a vulnerability. At least that's how I read it, right? That finally people are starting to go, okay, questioning long-held manipulation like Zionism or whether vaccine, all these things are suddenly going, maybe our vote is being manipulated. Maybe it is both sides. And so they just freaked out about it, tried to shut it down. A lot of what we predicted is now happening. But what kind of came of that is the IMA, right? Whitney and Derek and I discussed, okay, this is a weird thing that's happening. We haven't seen it like this before. We sense basically what the mainstream alternative media is becoming, right? And so we said we need to collect and just have like an alliance of people that we think are being honest, objective, nonpartisan, who see through what Zionism is, see through the two-party illusion, and just, no financial mechanism, just a collection of people that believe in integrity and principles and, crazy, right? And so they just lost it, And so here we are, and clearly what we were all pointing to is coming to pass, and now they're trying to turn it into, we all see it now. And it's just, I think it's kind of blowing up in their face. But the black pill thing, I think, is an important conversation, because I think it's like, it's like all the inversion of all the terms. Now it's like what they're claiming is somehow, fighting for the future is what is actually being black pilled by letting it all continue down the path when we're trying to stop the bad thing from happening, to oversimplify it.
But, I mean, I have noticed that way too many people, shall we say, on our side, are black pilled, nihilistic. They just give up on everything. There's no point. That's a very dark place to be.
Yeah, but it's understandable, isn't it? I don't agree with it, and I think it's like the last thing you should do. I mean, like I've always said, I don't care if I could prove to a certainty that we wouldn't succeed, whatever we think that looks like. I'd still be fighting. I don't know how you can't, right? It's like it's not in me to just give up and sit back. But you understand it, man. I mean, I think everything in what the power structures are trying to do, one of the major things within it all is to just make you give up, make it check out, right? Convince yourself that you can't influence it. They already spy on everything. Why even try? It's like that is being blackpilled. And that's central through the two-party paradigm, or at least on the other side, right? That's what that side does. And it's really all of it, but you get it. People get so, I mean, part of it is to make you feel like you can't change anything and really just not care enough to really be involved. But part of it is to get you to utterly check out, even if you care, because there's so many people in this field that really, really want something positive, would fight for it, but are so overwhelmed by how impossible it seems. Like getting involved and being one after another disillusioned by people you thought were going to change the world if you think politicians are going to change something, or movements that get co-opted, and so people that have spent 20 years fruitlessly fighting every day, tooth and nail, to just see the same thing happening, you just go, man, I'm just going to try to enjoy my life. Like, you understand it. But again, I agree with you. And I think it's like the least productive. It's the most dangerous thing we can do right now, especially because I genuinely think we have more opportunity than ever to make something change.
Let's just do a quick bio. Give me your background.
There's a lot to go over. I think the simple, quick background is that this started when, as I was saying, we were traveling. It was me and my friend at the time, and I'd traveled a lot over the years. Like this image, you can't see the top part of it where the logo is. Most people know it, but or at least the type. This image is. I took this image of people I backpacked with. This was in Spain.
When?
Shoot, it would have been 20. I have to look it up. 2020. Let me see if it was 2020. Like 23, 2022. I don't quote me on that, but basically there was a long period of time where I was traveling. It wasn't, was in the RV. First we did this. I backpacked across Spain. I was younger. I went to Italy, went to Greece. I've traveled to a bunch of countries just backpacking. That's where I kind of had that spirit. And then this was after that where my friend and I decided to take the RV around the United States. And I went to the Culinary Institute of America in Napa Valley. I'm a classically trained chef. That's what I've done my whole life. I love it. I've run restaurants. I've been executive chef, been general manager. I love the high. I've worked at L in that's in Sacramento. I've worked in now I'm blanking on the terms, places like the French Laundry in Napa Valley. The high level stuff. I've worked at middle grain place. I love it. I'm passionate about it. And so I decided to put that aside essentially because something was calling me in this direction. I didn't really think this wasn't even defined just yet. My point, so the point was I took this picture while traveling, and clearly it was, I think I just lost the train there. Anyway, so the point was that ultimately I traveled a lot and we went on the RV tour of the United States, and my buddy started a blog about sports or something. It was just because he just wanted to. And I said, oh, that's neat. I want to do that. Had no real idea of where it would go. It was just a random spur of the moment idea. The name jumped into my head, out of nowhere. The picture, it all just kind of fell together. And it started as a cannabis law reform thing, by and large. I'm very, very passionate about the idea, not just of smoking cannabis. That's sure that is important, your personal rights and all, and just whatever else. But it's more so about the lies around it that seemingly connect to damn near everything else, even foreign policy when you break it down. And so it kind of opened my mind to the massive lies told around what I think is one of the most monumentally, helpful, earth-changing things, hemp, cannabinoids in general, that we've just been just pulled away from our lives for obvious reasons. And so that it just exploded over the next probably 5 years to just be everything we're being lied about. And so it just kind of grew and grew. And even at that time, it was just a small little blog, and it was me with a couple of people, and we were just doing articles, no show. I think the turning point came when I randomly decided I wanted to do some kind of a show. And funny enough, and I always say this, go back and look at some of the stuff I did. It's still on there. I think I think YouTube's been deleted, but I think you can find it somewhere. One of the earliest videos I did, if not the first one, I've shown it before. It's so funny. The camera's way too close. I'm all uncomfortable. But I forced it through, and you wouldn't even know because I'd failed 4 times before that and got frustrated, didn't do it. But so I started the show and it started out 15 minutes long. Now it's 4 hours. But the point was just about trying to inform people. And I think that started to change what this platform was. And then I reached out to Derek Brose. I reached out to Whitney Webb, who was at that time was, just a writer for Mint Press News. Was doing, just kind of, in the field of Mint Press News. And ultimately, she was I think working on some of her writings and wanted her to come over and work with T-Lab, started writing a lot of that important work. And in that process, she was writing her book, and she built Unlimited Hangout, and then Robert Inlakesh. It's really important for me, by the way, to anybody who works with me. And now in no way to say I'm taking credit for that's all them. It's Conscious Resistance, Derek had way before me. It's just allowing people that work with me at the same time to continue to grow what they want on their side. Because I've in this field, I've worked with so many people that are come work with me, and they're you're ours. You can't work for yourself, you can't do anything else, and I just respect that. And so my point was that just kind of grew this out pretty rapidly, and it grew into more of a network, an ecosystem of people working together. And Taylor Hudak and Matt Ehret, and all different kind of people that work with T-Lab. And I think that brings us largely to the point where we're at, where it's just. Anything we cover is about trying to break through the illusion. I've gotten a lot more into the day-to-day stuff lately because I think it's really important to watch this weird transition of the mainstream alternative media. I've never seen it more obvious. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling beyond it, but the point was, I gave you the overview of how it came about. And, from there, we've done a lot of other things. We started Pirate Stream, which seems to kind of be drifting away, but IMA, we started that after, I just told you, and I hope to just keep growing this in a way that's continuing to gather people that we see really not about opinions, but just about principles, integrity. People that stand by, that show their actions, the precedent they set, and the outcome. They're consistent to what they believe in. And that seems rare today within the mainstream alternative media anyway.
Back in the early 2000s, when 9/11 happened, it didn't occur to me that this could have been a cover-up. And I think it was only around 2009 when I watched a documentary. I think it was called The Great Global Warming Swindle. That, I think, might have been my first Damascus moment, my first red pill moment. And when was yours?
It's funny. We get that question. We used to a lot more, but every time it comes up, it's weird because I think it was more, what's the right word for it? Measured, I guess, but like it wasn't as like some massive shoe that dropped for me, you know. Like so, I remember watching. I remember waking up on 9/11 and seeing that.
What were you doing, by the way?
What's that?
What were you doing? Sorry.
Oh, I just woke up. I was at my house. I woke up and walked out, and the TV was on. Weirdly, nobody was in the room. The TV was on, and I walked out and was like, "What?" And I just saw it, and weirdly enough, wasn't some like, you know. It was weird how, I mean, it was shocking, like, oh, that's crazy, but it wasn't like some, oh my God, you know, it's like, until I fully begun to understand like what seemed to be, you know, all of it. But even at that time, I was just like, probably just taking largely what was being presented, you know, but very early on in this conversation, it started to develop into something, you know, there's just suspicious parts about it that even at that time, when I was really not in the know for the most part, you know, that I was just picking up on. I think it became around the development of this site and the people that I overlapped with. You know what I mean? And I started, because, you know, I've always been very open-minded and wanted to hear people's opinions. I loved talking about things that, you know, fringe idea, you know, you can call that conspiracy theory, but it's plenty of things that are just even like fringe science ideas, you know, things of outer space, you know. So ultimately, I was always really open to just these ideas. And once I started to talk to people, interview with people, like one of the earliest things I did way before the show, even the website was barely going on. I think his name was Dara. He was a blind guy that ran a radio station. He's a good guy. And like a local kind of his own personal, you know, broadcast radio thing. And he liked the show or the website and stuff. And he saw me online and reached out to me and said, hey, like, you know, come on the show. Came on the show. And then that was the first time he wanted me to continue to do the show with him. And so we started coming to the show, and he was really into all these different things. And we started doing a thing on the show called Conspiracy Crossfire, where we basically had a big hat full of like every conspiracy listed and we would just draw and talk about it at the end of the show. And so it, like, you know, you start to learn more and understand these things. And even just from an entertainment perspective, which, by the way, I think is part of this, it's kind of weaponized today, that people are like more in like the reality TV version of a lot of this. But my point was that the entertainment value of it all is just, it's entertaining. It's interesting to read about these crazy ideas. My point is that over this time, it really evolved for me, you know, like kind of like a slow growing process where I'm like, wow, that's crazy. That's what happened. And I mean, there was things like I saw James Corbett do something about like Oklahoma City. I don't know, like so many years ago. And I remember going like, oh my God, like, so that guy too was like MK Ultra. You know, it's like you don't realize how many of these things interconnect. Even to this day, I will research something. For example, I looked into Rwanda. It was the anniversary of Rwanda. I always hate using that word for some reason. Anniversary doesn't seem appropriate. And I looked into it with what's going on today, and I just figured, you know, like, I know that there was an overlap with Israel, but I'm curious to dive further. Never really done that. And I was absolutely blown away by how shockingly clear and obvious it was. If you don't know this, by the way, Israel was like arming and involved with that genocide. Same with Bosnia, same with South Africa, running theme here. The point is that I was blown away by how easy it was to prove, right on the surface, arming them with Uzis and machetes. Anyway, I'm just going like, oh my God, that blew my mind. And so even to this day, I still find that I blow into new theories and I go, wow, that changed my mind. So I think that's what a lot of people go through. I think the whole kind of shoe dropping awareness of certain things, I think that represents that people that they were already sort of aware, you know what I mean? Like they were seeing it, but not allowing themselves to accept it. And that was kind of the moment that brought it all together, as opposed to where I think I was always pretty skeptical, and it just kind of grew for me as I learned more, which is kind of a different way about it. But you know, it's different for each of us.
The COVID era for me was very exciting on so many levels. One of the reasons is because it appeared to me that a huge number of people were quote unquote waking up. However, Ryan, I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, but it appears now that all those people have gone back to sleep.
You know, it's weird there's a lot of factors to that. You know, yes, I think in a lot of cases, which is always how it tends to go, is that you have moments of awareness like we're dealing with right now, which is what I always point out, and that there's always something, an event, you know, maybe organized, maybe hoax, maybe psyop, or maybe an organic event that they use. Who knows? But, you know, never let a good crisis go to waste. The point is that there's always something that comes along that shocks people back into place. Feels less likely today, to be honest. Today feels different. It really does. But That's always what happens. So after that, there was something else, and people, it's usually partisan driven, and it drives people back into like people that have like warped their identity around partisan politics, which I also think is dwindling. And so it just kind of shocks them back into place because they feel like they have an obligation to do so. But so I know there was a lot of people throughout COVID that kind of fell into that trap that still, I think, were skeptical of some of the other things, but are now, maybe kind of lost in other new narratives. But there's also an element to that of people that were not really even, whether they were aware or not, were using that awareness to kind of straddle along, kind of sidle up next to this movement and use it to benefit themselves, maybe for the next agenda. This is what I always see happening. I see it happening right now. Not to name anybody in particular, but people that I think are like one step removed from mainstream media who suddenly go, oh, I see it, Israel bad and whatever else, or did it during COVID rather to make the point. And we're like, these are killing people. We see it now. And again, people, oh my God, they see it. Oh, look at that. They're finally coming around. And then the moment that they had an opportunity or it was important to them to pull you back into something partisan, that's what they did. And a lot of us started to recognize, or even right back into the COVID-19 thing, promoting mRNA shots the moment it was in their benefit. The point is, I think a lot of them recognized an opportunity to use that momentum to benefit them, or the power structure did the same. And so I think those two things exist. But overall, I still think that most people came out of that different, a little bit more aware, if, to one degree or another. And evidenced by the fact that even Democrats at this point, or, even right early during the what was it? The Omicron, I think, and right after, but just as a notation for time, whatever you think that means, that most Democrats at that point were resisting the sixth booster, whatever it was at the time. And I remember thinking that was so crazy because these are people that had taken every shot like dutifully, or at least a lot of them, and were telling you were a bad person for not. And then suddenly there was that sixth was too much for them. Right. So and their government was going, that's important. You have to. Same thing they said before. So showing you that there was a line for them, and even they stopped. And now it's like more than half of even healthcare workers are refusing these shots. And that was on the FDA. They said that in the last interview they had. And so I'm just going like, wow, man, that didn't go away. Now, maybe they're lost in the Israel conversation. Maybe they're lost in the immigration conversation. But that is a powerful thing to think about. And honestly, last point to this, I truly believe that more than anything right now, regardless of the different partisan stances, the vast majority of people are very disillusioned about everything government. I think that's quite
a good
obvious.
thing. That's a good thing.
I completely agree.
But at the same time, Donald Trump has done a magnificent job of bringing millions of people back into the system. I speak to a lot of Trump supporters, and I'm not anti-Trump. I like, it's not 1 or 0. I like some things that he says and does, and I don't like other things that he says and does. And I know that he's a puppet and he's only really essentially middle management.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing we were just talking about. People want to believe. And same point as the bad stuff before. I understand. I get why we've been conditioned to desperately seek somebody to end all the bad things. It's like, it's easy to see how this has been constructed. And so it's like when somebody comes out and goes, I promise to end all those bad things. We go, oh my God, somebody's even, nobody's even pointed to those things before, and we saw that with his last administration. The Fed, 9/11, lock her up, and it's like, they're good people. Shut up. We're going to leave them alone. It's like, okay, clearly that was used. And the same thing we can see today with Maha and, every other argument. I mean, it's embarrassing to see how many ways they've continued. And then you get people like Cat Turd on Twitter that come out and go, we're winning. Everything's great. And I'm like, you're the living embodiment of that meme. That's like, this is fine. The house is burning down, and it's clear that they're just trying to corral people into it. But, I think that a lot of people are trapped back into it. But I do still think that people like, look at Epstein. That has fractured them right now. Now, you could argue that's because of how bad they handled that. I mean, Trump coming out and calling it a hoax after it was driving their momentum seems pretty stupid and ill-advised. But clearly, if that's possible, then it was already building right there, and I do see that. I think my point was, I think more people at this point are skeptical, whether or not they're conservative, Republican, MAGA, support Trump. They're like, okay, something's wrong. Whether and really what it's coming down to, which I think is important to start considering, is most of them are like, I still support Trump or even RFK Jr., but they're being manipulated, right? They're being blackmailed by Israel, or RFK's being blackmailed by something. And so it's like, okay, maybe I would not even, that's probably likely even, but that doesn't just, remove them from responsibility, but that gives them a pass. That gives them an ability to go, we all still love Trump and he's the great guy, but it's Israel doing it. And now how Trump gets around that, especially when you start to understand that he is completely taken by Israel, that's the confounding moment for them. And I think that's why right now the government, not just the one side of it, is really concerned about where this is going. And at last, I do think the technocratic side of it is their last effort to sort of, get us to a point to where our opinions don't matter anymore.
But Ryan, haven't you followed the latest Q drop? Trust the plan, bro.
Yeah, right, exactly. Military tribunals. Like I remember when we were covering that. I remember talking about that before it was even called Q. And it was like follow the white rabbit. All these different people that were out there talking about, helicopter crashes and Marines and stuff. There was these stories that were circulating right when that was kind of going around. And I remember laughing at it, going like, well, interesting, but where's the source material? Yeah, look at that consistency all the way back then. Where's the source material? How can you prove these things? And so it evolved. And even in the beginning, I'm thinking, okay, like maybe this is interesting. Like, what if you actually have people in the government that are, secretly seeking to change it for the better? And it's like, okay, so let's follow this. And it became wildly evident right or before it even shifted into being partisan that this was weird, right? There was something off about this, the way people were assuming about what it meant. That was obviously a bad sign, right? And using that to make arguments. But the most obvious point was where it was like just hard shift into Trump, MAGA, Republican, when in the very beginning, it was talking about how the parties were a lie and how it's like, so something didn't, it was a manipulation from the very beginning, as far as I'm concerned, or at the very least, there was some kind of an element that got hijacked and they used it for the same problem. I don't really know. I think it comes back to the evidence showing that this was a manipulation from day one and that there's certain people you could argue were most likely behind it, but it's clearly using for the, to perpetuate that same problem. But I mean, I honestly can't believe people still give any kind of credence to that. But despite how many times it has been proven to be completely wrong, but then you make the same point about Alex Jones, you make the same point about everything the corporate media says or everything the mainstream alternative media says, but they just keep going back for more, some of them anyway.
What do you mean by the term mainstream alternative media? I saw David Icke about a year or two ago using it. It was the first time I've ever seen it being used.
Yeah, I think he coined it, to be honest. I think he's the one, or at least, really popularized it. That's at least where I picked it up from. And it is, so the mainstream media just represents corporate media, like a captured business, not about information. It is about using information to control opinion. That's self-evident at this point, on top of the fact, and very partisan-driven elements. But on top of that, we can see that it's been infiltrated by intelligence. There's 100 examples of that right to this very day. So mainstream alternative media, in my opinion, first, is the extension of that same manipulation because they're aware that nobody listens to mainstream media anymore, right? So early on, and we're talking like, at least David would point back to like some of the earlier days of like the independent media becoming really a recognized thing, that they were immediately trying to co-opt people, trying to, start new, get people that like, and I don't know who. You can make your opinion, decide about like a Megyn Kelly or Tucker. But I think what's interesting is these are people that, like I said, are like half a step removed from corporate media. And now, we're calling out the problem, and it just feels very suspicious to me, any number of them. But so then it evolved into a little bit further, which we see today, which is like this clear kind of like, not just the people that moved away from mainstream and started saying things, but people like, random that, came out of nowhere. Like random TikTok guy that came out and within 6 months, he's got 10 million followers and he's endorsed by everybody in the field. Go ahead.
Ian Carroll, is it?
Well, there's one of them. Yeah, there's plenty of them, and it's interesting to watch. And my point is always, and I'll make it a general point, is that I think right now the majority, or let's just say a large part, if not the majority of mainstream alternative media are people that aren't even consciously aware that they're being used. Whether that's I literally don't see it because I just don't care, or it's willful ignorance that I don't want to look where that funding is coming from because then it will stop my momentum, or, whatever it is, or audience capture through the same kind of mechanisms. I think a lot of people are, being used in that way and aren't, you people are, you're a shill, and they will go, no, I'm not. And they truly believe they're not. It's like, it's an interesting development, but there are still the ones that I think are absolutely knowingly like intelligence or working for a foreign government or working for the U.S. government, whatever it is. Clearly, I think that's obvious. But so that's what it is to me, is kind of like the new adaptation of that control structure through the thing that they saw taking over the structure, which is alternative media. So they just mainstreamed it. Right? Started co-opting, capturing, creating their own fake independent platforms, Newsmax and One American News. It's like, it's just, on left and right, by the way. It's just your government doing it. But that's what I mean by that. And today it's just evolved into something that's becoming more cartoonish by the day.
How much of everything that's going on around us, Ryan, do you think is by design and by emergence?
It's hard to say. I would not question everything. Like if somebody was like, I'm making an argument about why they think every single thing that we ever see is in some way influence, control. Honestly, that seems very possible today, and it wouldn't surprise me. But I do think that there's organic things. I mean, I think I can speak for myself. You know, which don't take my word. Question everything I do. Go look to the source material. Don't take my word. But you know, I'm organic. I'm honest. I'm not influenced by anybody. I decide every day what I want to talk about. The funding is by donation only. There's nobody. You know, it's so I know that there are organic things in this, and I know that we have some level of success. So I would never say that there's not possible. There are people out there that are genuinely doing things for the right reasons that get some level of. I just don't think we're ever at a point where you're ever again going to see anything like organically go viral unless that's something the structure wants to allow. I think that has been the way for a long time. And so, you know, it's hard. That paints a picture of, even if, like I said, even the people out there that may not know they're being manipulated or in some ways being manipulated. And so that's just at an influence level, you can see how that can trickle through almost everything we see. I mean, the mainstream media, for example, or media, Hollywood. It's not a secret. I mean, if you know that the Pentagon was involved with movies like Toy Story, which you can look up for yourself, you know, to propagandize you to be pro-America. It's like, this is everywhere. So there's nothing free. Anytime they have an opportunity to try to put something in front of you for, even if they think it's for your benefit, they rationalize that you thinking that's going to save the country. The point is still the same. That it's not real, right? And so I think it's obvious that we're in a very weird state where with algorithms and AI manipulation and large language models and digital twins, and, you know, we're at a point where I don't even think we truly grasp how far we've gone to in that direction. You know, or you could take it even a step further, just to have a conversation about it for fun, that maybe we're living in something that's not real in the first place. You know, it's like there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but I think it's a lot of what we deal with is just manufactured, influenced, lied about, you know, sadly enough. But that's, again, something we can change.
Your Hollywood comment is actually very, very well taken. I mean, if you think about any movie that has the FBI or CIA in it, they are always the good guys.
Well, you know what's funny? I agree with that, but there have been times, like I've noticed a shift over the years where, you know, there was a time like that was the case where it always kind of seemed that it was, you know, they were saving the day. And then there was a period where it almost always ended up being like the corporate villain who was taking advantage of them. And that's not the same story, but then it became like intelligence, like a you know, like Mission Impossible, where it is the U.S. government that's doing the bad thing, but it's also the U.S. government saving you. And the narrative is the rogue agent that goes on his own, you know, who saves you from the villain government. Okay, so the logic is don't get mad when the government breaks the rules to save you. Isn't that exactly what Trump's kind of overarching narrative is right now? You know, it's just funny. It's like the whole point is predictive programming, you know, and that's the idea is these things are done not just to subtly convince you that America's great or whatever they want you to think, but to convince you of very specific ideas. Like here, a weird example, which people have a reason. It's not illogical. How do I say that right? The movie White Noise that came out before East Palestine. That's just, I just talked about it again 2 days ago. It's so weird. Not the movie, but just East Palestine, that you could easily look at that and be like coincidence. You know what I mean? But in crazy coincidence, right down to the smoke, the sky, the location, which is insane, you know, or everything else that happened, and just go like, was there something to that? You know, was this designed to put, you know, give us a certain impression about, who knows? But it's certainly, like, mathematically speaking, think about how hard, the odds of that. And in every location in the world, this one place is the same place, which is the same way the sky looked, which is the same event. You know, it's really weird, but I think that speaks for itself.
I can add to what you're saying. During the COVID era, I stumbled across a movie called Contagion. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Came out, I think, in 2011. I'd never in my life heard of the movie. And I watched it and the hair on my arms stood up because everything was precisely how it played out.
Yep. Yeah.
Even the term social distancing was in the movie. And I had never heard that term before 2020.
I know, man. And see, this is the weird thing. Now, you can go back and look and see that there were rumblings of this, like outlines. And I'm sure you've seen that, like, you know, and this was pre-COVID-19, but it was clearly used and introduced during this time frame, but that they were having models like, okay, let's not forget, Event 201 was before this all started. Even before that, you have Crimson Contagion. You've got Event 201 or a Dark Winter, and, you know, there's tons of them. And if you look back to these exercises, there's even some for SPARS going forward. We passed the date, arguably, when it was supposed to happen, but, you know, it's not always exact, if that's even the way that works. But the point is that in those, if you look, they sure as hell outline this stuff, you know, social distancing, masks, different quarantine dynamics, or even the idea of stuff that we never even heard of before. Like, you know, everything we experienced, all the crazy things of the way they treated elderly people. But the weird thing was how in most of these, like, U.S. government run exercises, like spars, for example. If you read this, this still blows my mind. They frame themselves as the villain. They literally have part of the story where the media catches them lying about part of the story. And I'm going like, they frame themselves as the deceptive liars. It's like, how do we not take what that show? They know. I mean, I don't know how you would frame that. Is that because they know we see them that way? Is that to sort of like undermine that that's the truth? I don't know, but I still find that very telling. And then what do you know? They get caught lying about every single thing about the story. It's very weird. But yeah, your point is well taken that this was either socially engineered into our minds to sort of accept that that's what would happen, or it was just something we're testing our ideas on it. Like there's a part of that people don't think about. A lot of it can be just testing the waters, rolling it out in a specialized circumstance to see how we respond, or doing exercises with communities and how do they act when we do that. That happens a lot, by the way.
How do you filter what you read and see? How do you know what's true and how do you know what's not true?
You question everything you don't. Right? Until you can prove something. And even then, you still got to question whether you could be missing something. Right? And people hate that idea. That's just being genuinely objective. It doesn't mean you just do nothing all the time. The point is that, you look to source material and you report based on what the facts show as best you can, while always keeping your mind open to the fact that you could be missing something. Like, you don't have to always state that. That should be sort of self-evident if we weren't in such a clouded, ridiculous part of our history. But that's why I jokingly call it irritatingly objective, even though it's just being objective. It's like people are just so unused to that. But it's my process is everything I can in it. Like, so let's take it like this: East Palestine happens, or anything like that. I dive into the story. Corporate media, right? What are they saying about it? What's being reported? Who's there? What's going on? At least as they claim. Where's the source material to what they're claiming? What are the agencies involved saying? Compare it to what they wrote, right? Let's find, and once you have someone like Scott C. Smith on the ground, okay, what is he seeing? Compare it to what they said. And you keep these things. So you can go all the way back 6 months later and go, oh, look at what they said day one. That contradicts now, things like that. But you always question all of it. None of it's taken at face value, whether it's CNN or whether it's an independent investigator or somebody right next to me working along my team. It's like you question everything, and it shouldn't be insulting. That's just because we could be wrong, right? We could genuinely believe we're right and be missing something. And so you absorb all of it you can. My point is, if you're just kind of looking at everything all day, you have to kind of fine tune your focal point, right? And so you go to a story and you're investigating that story. My point is, you look at every possible data point you can and try to come to your own conclusions about it. And, and usually you'll find some kind of a series of information or also, by the way, most important, I think, precedent. No, that doesn't prove, right? But when these things start, you go, okay, what's Norfolk Southern been involved in before, right? What happened the last time there was a disaster? How did they handle that? What do the narratives say? What did it end up being, right? And then you look and you go, okay, there's some comparative points here. And so, again, right there, this is what mainstream media and mainstream tend to do, is that you go, you kind of sprawl into that based on that happened, therefore we know they're guilty. And even if they are guilty later, you were still dumb and irresponsible for doing it based on your assumption. That's the way this grows today. But I think that explains, just everything you can possibly look at. And I think I try to err on the side of what you can prove, or always, if that's, if it's available, that should be the only thing you're really using to guide the story, is what you can actually prove on the ground, what's actually happening, And then for me, I've followed up on these stories as they go forward. What have they done? Things that people, the new story comes, the new 24-hour news cycle goes crazy and people drift in the background. People don't find out that, for example, Norfolk Southern was caught in court admitting that they withheld information from the volunteer fire chief that vinyl chloride was actually treated vinyl chloride, which meant it was very unlikely to explode. Still, most people don't seem to know that. I've said that like 1,000 times on my show, and the fire chief himself alluded to the idea that he was somewhat railroaded, no pun intended, in that same point, basically saying, giving him limited information and then like forcing him to feel like he has to make a choice, choosing to explode this, and then finding out that it wasn't even necessary. Like I still argue there was something that happened there, not to get off on that topic, but that we don't even understand. Something very weird went down there beyond what else happened. I'm convinced of that. But, so the point is, you keep following these things and the stories become clear, at least as much as we can. And you just got to continue to be objective as it goes forward.
But do you question everything? I mean, I've had flat earthers on my show,
yep. And
I must tell you, I've had some of the best discussions with them.
It's an interesting topic. To that very point, I had a show I did a long time ago called, I think it was just called Flat Earth Theory, an exercise in keeping an open mind. That's what it was, And so I did and I researched this for quite a while because, same, even to this very day, I get people that are like, you didn't even look, and here you got to check this link out. And it's like, I look.
It does look flat, though. I mean, it does look flat if you're honest with yourself.
Well, no. The point is that look, I think long story short, I went through it very in depth. And everything anybody's ever sent me, plus everything else I could find, I've researched, I don't think that's what the evidence shows. But what's interesting is that it's like with the moon discussion. Okay, if you find things like Antarctica, if you find all these different, things you can prove, for example, like faked photographs. Now, does that then prove they didn't go? No. It proves something happened. They lied for some reason. One of the options could be that's the case. Same with the Earth thing. Okay, there's all these different examples that I think I conflated those two. Antarctica is flat Earth. But the point is that the moon or any of those conversations, there's evidence that suggests that something's awry. To jump to that's what it means, in my opinion, is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It could mean that. There could be logic around that. And there's plenty of very interesting points that suggest, like Antarctica and is it Colonel Bird?
Colonel,
yes,
Bird, else. I think it's Bird.
It is Bird, but it's I forget. It's a different I think Colonel or whatever his rank was. He Admiral Bird, I think is what it was. He long story short, I'm sure you remember, there's very weird stuff about what happened there, and maybe no one's allowed to go over. There's all these different things around that story, and including the scientific stuff that I think is very strange, the radar stuff. I agree. These things stand out to me as you can't deny the weirdness of that. What does that mean? Could mean that, or it could mean something else. So my long story short, I don't think that's what it proved. But yes, very much so. Always an open mind. And I'll give you one more point that I think is important. This people put this to me almost they think it's going to be a gotcha moment. Oh yeah, I question everything. What about God? Because I'm a Christian, right? And I go, yeah. I leave it, wait and see what they say. Like as if, most people respond like, what? You don't believe in God? It's like, they have to think this through. First of all, now, and I make a very big point to not overlap my religion with politics. I think they're inherently counterintuitive. One's based on faith, one's based on fact. It's like, I can't stand when people in the mainstream alternative media blend their religion with their politics. That's manipulation. It's propaganda. Now, my point, though, is that in this conversation, can I question whether God exists? Yes. Question everything. I question. Do I think God, is it possible? That's not yes. I choose to have faith. That's what religion is. If you think out there that you believe in God because you know for a fact, then you don't understand how this works. Probably, it's inherently based on the choice to have faith that that's the case. That's my personal response. That's my personal life, right? And so I choose that. But am I willing to consider or question, is it possible that I'm wrong? Yes. That's not blasphemous because I then choose to have faith about that. My point, though, is that every single thing in our lives, everything, we should be willing to stand back and go, is it possible that I'm wrong? Is it possible there's something I'm not seeing that changes this entirely? And genuinely go, yes, that is possible. Then you're not being honest with yourself, right? And that's an important thing. It's weird how uncommon that even is today. And I think that's by design. But even saying that and explaining it as I did, that I think is just very clear, you still get people they're Christians. They say, it's blasphemous. And I think it's just funny that they've been convinced somehow that, same kind of people, by the way, that would tell you that God sent Trump, things like that. Or, on both sides of the paradigm, but a lot of it seems to center around, somehow like this is some God-sent idea. And you talk about blasphemous, it's idolatry, but in a different conversation.
You shouldn't be afraid of what the answer might be. Because if you're searching for the truth, then the truth will be revealed. Yep, one way or the other.
And the point is to question everything. And that doesn't mean deny anything. That's the whole. In fact, it's funny how that gets taken as dismissing. In fact, the words mean the opposite. If you're questioning everything, you're engaging everything, every source, every possible data point. It's the funny thing is, question everything's the tagline because that's just a concise tagline. But the real idea is question everything while considering all possibilities. But that's not as nice to say, So it's just that's the real way to look at that, And I think everyone's beginning to see that, especially today, as almost every 30 seconds now, there's some new story proving that the government lied, or that these people in media were lying about this, or caught working for somebody else. And, and so people are just one after another, or COVID-19 are starting to see that it's just smart to question these things.
I don't know how to ask this question. So Ben Shapiro, I think he coined the statement, facts don't care about your feelings. And I've often said that he's not correct in that, because human history is about storytelling and narratives.
Yes and no. I think what you're talking about might be two separate things. So I would argue, especially with what we do, that there is empirical truth. And that doesn't mean we always agree on that. Right? Scientists can disagree on what they think is the empirical truth, but I do think that there is one truth. about what we're talking about, about one there. That's like the universal reality, in my opinion, that there is a provable, to argue that there are different truths about one thing would come from like a philosophical, like quantum mechanics kind of point, that your reality is only for you, it's a whole different idea. But so if we're talking about
postmodernism,
yeah, right. But if you're just talking about just information and we're not getting into the philosophical, then there's a truth, right? There's one truth about one fact or one idea, right? Did this happen or not? There's one answer. Now we can debate that. But so what's interesting is your point, though, is that the way that information can move is very much connected with emotion, with feeling, with just what's exciting. But at the same point, just how you can tell the story the right way. And over the years, even before we had TV media, sitting around the fire telling stories to keep history going, a lot of times that became blended with what made the story exciting to repeat. What got it to become a story that people wanted to hear. And a lot of times that was folded in with myth and, and these by design in some cases to make sure that these stories continued. There's all sorts of different things like that. But so I don't disagree. I think there's a lot of that to it. But to what Ben was saying, which I agree with, even though today he's showing that he doesn't agree with that, which I think is hilarious, is that, the point is facts are facts and they don't care about whether you don't like them. Is the real point he was trying to make, at the time when he was pointing at woke college kids doing the same thing he's now doing for Israel. It's just so embarrassing to watch. They literally did a tour about cancel culture and using, shutting down speech. And now they're doing the exact same thing for woke right, broflakes and snowflakes. It's the same thing. But yeah, I think that it is important to consider both. That clearly emotion plays a factor, and that's how propagandists very much use it against you. But that remember that there is, when it comes down to source material and truth, that there's just one fact when we're talking about the information.
I got very excited now when you said woke right, because it's something that I've also pointed out and I keep getting pushback. Oh, it can only exist on the political left. No, it exists everywhere.
Well, because it's not about, this is the people that say that only think woke means pronouns and trans. It's not what it means. It's just, this is the way that they choose to view it. Like, okay, but even if you want to take their argument, wouldn't they say cancel culture? Yes, they would, right? So if we're talking about them shutting down speech around anti-Semitism, even these people can obviously see that's the same thing, if not just a slightly focused version of it. I argue that's really what was the whole point regardless. It's not about what it is. I mean, today, clearly Zionism, Israel, and the influence, that's important to them, and that's why that's the focus in one way. But from the point of why it's being used from like a control structure point, it's the same outcome. It's about controlling speech or using speech to control you. Right? And not just to censor you, but to use that as the justification to deport people, to arrest people, to remove citizenship, to spy, to surveil, to 100 different things we could list off. Right? So it's clear that those things both play a factor. But so obviously the woke right, or that we jokingly call the broflakes, it's like it's all about, it's cancel culture. It is censorship around speech. Right? It's ideological manipulation. I mean, that's what this comes down to. And it's very clear to see that it exists on both sides. I mean, right now, like, for example, you saw people like libs of TikTok after the whatever you want to call the shooting for Trump at Butler. There was people there was, what was it? One was a woman that worked at Home Depot who made a very tasteless joke that said, man, I wish the guy was a better shot or something like that. Clearly, she's talking about hoping Trump was killed. But if you can't take a step back and realize how many people on the right have made exactly similar comments about Biden and whatever, the point is, yes, that's distasteful, but she obviously has a right to say what she thinks, right? And obviously done in a way that was meant to be a joke. Point is, criticize it, but they went after her. They found out who she was. They got her name. And it was tweet and captioned and quoted, and they kept going, and libs of TikTok shared it, and they got her fired from her job. How is that not exactly what the left was doing to anything they didn't like about the right? We all know it's the same thing if we're being honest with ourselves. The people that are trying to scream it's not are the ones that are only invested in one side of the paradigm, and they're part of the problem, whether they know it or not.
Is Israel controlled by the U.S. or is the U.S. controlled by Israel?
It's a fair question. And I think it's an opinion, and I think plenty of people make the argument that it's the U.S. dictating. And by the way, there's plenty of points that make that seem logical. That the U.S. is ultimately the one dictating Israeli. And one of the larger reasons, Israeli policy, one of the larger reasons people make that point today is because, and rightly so, that you can see that the U.S. government, if they decided to, could stop funding right now and the war would largely collapse, right? And so you can easily go, okay, well then they're controlling it. But that's not fact. That's a logical conclusion based on the way that appears, right? So clearly that's only one point, though. So to answer your question, I think it's obvious if you look at my work. I think it's very obvious that the Israeli government has shocking level of influence, if not complete control over U.S. policy. And what's wild today is it's gone so mainstream that people, Glenn Greenwald was just saying in regard to Republicans being in Israel that I think his caption was, politicians going to speak at their home district when they're in Israel talking to Netanyahu. Like, that's what he's saying. George Galloway talking about how weird it is that they're all going to bow at the Wailing Wall. Like, these are things that used to be roundly called anti-Semitism, even by some of them. And now it's like, the point is, it's not hard to see. It's not about, look, there's an overlap to religion because of what Zionism does. And we can get into that if you want to. The B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights group, openly calls it Jewish supremacism because that does exist. But it's not just about Judaism. There's plenty of Jewish groups that actively call out Zionism. So we have to be objective about that, right? But clearly it does exist. The point is that this is this overwhelming thing, moving religion from it, that is on the surface, that you can see, not just AIPAC, but any number of ways that the Israeli society, the Israeli government, Israeli entity, Israeli intelligence are like publicly immersed with what this country is, to the point to where most of our Congress is willing to go against their own constituents' interest for what Israel wants. Right on the surface, shouting down people who are going to vote for them because they don't think they're doing the right thing. At what point have we ever seen that? Historically, what we remember of politicians is they're wishy-washy. They'll say whatever they need to say to get your vote, right? Except when it comes to Israel. That's a very common statement, except when it comes to Israel, when it comes to U.S. politicians. It's very clear to me. The evidence, as far back as you want to go, shows that there has been provable evidence of that, whether it's infiltration, assassination, blackmail, which is easily provable. But then you go into things like evidence of Netanyahu talking to his own people. Leaked evidence of him saying, it's so easy to control the U.S. government. I put the left versus the right. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he was insinuating. And it's so easy to manipulate them. Don't worry, we can control them. It's like very clear. Or how many times that he has driven the U.S. government, to war, right? For the Israeli government. Like every single one from, you can go down the list, has been for Israel. So it's obvious that's the case. But I would argue that's very similar to a lot of other places in the world. Now, I can't speak to as much insight, like I'm focused on what's happening here, but the UK, France, for example, I think it's the same thing. I think it's Germany. I think it's very obvious. And whether that's just, go ahead.
So I was going to say JFK wasn't all that keen on Israel, though.
Yeah, the good point, right? So JFK, it was just before he was killed. The two main things that were happening was he was calling to register AIPAC as a foreign agent. And it wasn't, I think it was called something different when that was happening, but the point was they were trying to register them, and I've covered in the show, I'm just blanking on what it's called. He wanted them to register as a foreign agent under FARA. Then he died. Then they changed the name and then pretended it was an American company. And you can look it up on Wikipedia. It was an Israeli thing that was created by Israeli government and Israeli people, and it was not about just Americans in Israel or in the United States who are Jewish. It's Israeli company, Israeli group. And it's easy to prove. And so they became the most influential lobby. Over 80% of politicians on left and right. Very clear that's an obvious problem. But my point was JFK. So that was one thing. And the other thing was the Dimona nuclear research facility. They wanted that to go away because clearly they were working on nuclear weapons, right? And JFK died and those things went back to the background. That's not hard to see, right? And we all can, it's provable evidence today. They have nuclear weapons, and they only country in the world we even give a name to it, not publicly, but in the background, it's called nuclear ambiguity. Only country in the world that gets that. And they've even accidentally said they've gotten them many times, and the U.S. government still refuses to acknowledge that. You can only have so many how do you say it? Like that there's things that happen that you don't see happen anywhere else other than the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Not just like their friends, passing random things, but like weird anomalies or things they choose not to say or things they'll do against their interests. And it's only in this relationship. So, so this is my point is everyone does see this. And I'm not trying, I rarely am hyperbolic. I'm rarely the kind of person that will make a statement even like that. But I've been saying it's like with COVID or anything else, guys. It's easy to see. The whole world, other than the governments that are manipulated, the people propagandizing around it are very aware of what's going on right now, just to varying degrees of what they think is happening, but at least that they're committing a genocide in plain daylight that everyone's a part of that they don't want to stop. It's just insane to me.
Let's come in for a landing. Give me a nugget of wisdom, a parting thought.
Well, it's kind of like the stuff we talked about today. My whole thing today, what I'm really trying to stress to people is, we have these moments throughout history, and there's been plenty of them in the past, where you have these moments of awareness, or other different, kind of things, moments of possible change that are very clear, right? People are, let's put it this way, that the power structure is for one reason or another kind of vulnerable, and it's obvious that we have a moment to do something right now. And I was saying the same thing when, like, we had this really worldwide kind of moment for a week or so, and it still is continuing, but like right around when the protests were starting in colleges, right? And of course, you saw this massive thing that turned into framing them and lying about what they were doing, and turning it into they're all racist and hate Jews, even though it was put on by Jewish organizations, even though there was largely Jews that were there. It's insane what happened. But the point is that then bowled over into what the immigration thing is. But the point was this became a worldwide movement. I talked about this. It was like I was like moved by it. And this wasn't, people in this country love to box everything into left and right as we see it, but it's not the same everywhere. There's different liberal leanings. But the point is that around the world, people from all walks of life, all religions, all different political standings were screaming about this. Not just that we need to stop what they're doing, but the kind of the sentiment that we are all Palestine, right? That this is not about Palestinians alone. Yes, what their genocide and what they're doing to them is the most important thing to me in the world right now. But the point is that this is larger than that, and they know that. They're the ones trying to tell you that. Like the whole argument that they always say that if we don't stop Hamas, you're next. The reality is the other way around, right? The reality is that if we don't stop what they're doing, which we're already seeing, ask Lebanon, ask Syria, ask Egypt, ask anybody else in the greater Israel boundary, and then beyond that, what they're already talking about, Smotrich and the rest. So the point is that this is going to expand. And let's be clear, biblical, or rather religious Zionism, which seems to be half of Trump's cabinet, if not more, Huckabee, Hegseth, like openly, proudly, Miller, they believe, and you can ask Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and the rest, they believe that the West has to collapse before the, Israeli government, to make it simple, will kind of control the world. That's America first? These are people that are in Trump's cabinet who believe that that's how this should go. So just recognize that we're at a moment where we can actually step up and change this, and the world sees it. I've never seen a better opportunity to see something really change. And, maybe we could talk about living in a world with no government. I'd love to have that conversation, but that might be a little too much for people. But just see how we can change things today. And I do think it's more possible than ever. So thanks for having me on, brother. I'd love to do this again.
Just quickly, how can I follow you?
Any platform for the most part. The tag is usually TLA Vagabond, Twitter, Gab, anything else. But as always, I recommend, literal most platforms other than the ones we've been censored from, which are quite a few, you can find us that way. But I recommend, as always, going directly to the website, thelastamericanvagabond.com. And I always say, don't let the platforms, whether the ones you trust or not, be the conduit between you and our information. Go right to the source, right? Go to what we're saying on the website, and then from there, if you want to, broaden out, or rather do that to any websites you like, right? But go right to the source. I think that's important, both because of, if you're supporting us through YouTube or Rumble, well, you're really supporting Rumble to a degree. You know what I mean? As opposed to going right to the site and watching it there. I think that's important. But thelastamericanvagabond.com, and we will have more coming around a few other things. Like, I guess I don't think it's a website, but we're going to be having like an IMA page for the Independent Media Alliance on the new Odyssey portal coming, and I'll point that out as it comes along. But yeah, largely the website. So thanks for having me on, brother.